Some men return from war carrying medals. Others return carrying silence. By the time anyone in the little town of Red Lodge, Montana, realized that 71-year-old Thomas Tom Callahan had almost stopped speaking altogether, it had already become part of the landscape, as ordinary as the old grain elevator standing against the endless prairie sky. People still nodded to him when he walked into Jensen's Hardware on Broadway Avenue every other Thursday. The cashier at the grocery store still asked how he was doing. The waitress at the Stockman Cafe still poured his black coffee before he sat down. Tom answered almost everything with the same faint nod. Sometimes one word, sometimes none. Nobody could remember exactly when the conversations disappeared. It wasn't sudden. Silence had settled over him, the way snow slowly buries a fence line during a Montana winter, one storm at a time, until only the top rail remained. There had once been another version of Tom. Neighbors remembered a broad-shouldered Army veteran who laughed with his whole chest, who coached Little League after returning from overseas, who built cedar picnic tables for church fundraisers, who never missed the 4th of July parade, and who could fix almost anything with enough patience and a coffee can full of bolts collected over 40 years. Now his pickup truck rarely left the gravel driveway except for groceries, prescriptions from the VA clinic in Billings, and fuel. His mailbox overflowed more often than not. His front porch light burned every night because replacing the bulb gave him one less thing to think about. Inside the modest ranch house, the television usually stayed off. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was heavy. Every room carried traces of someone no longer there. His wife, Margaret, had died 3 years earlier after a long fight with pancreatic cancer. She had been the translator between Tom and the rest of the world without either of them realizing it. She filled awkward pauses, remembered birthdays, invited neighbors over, insisted they attend church suppers even when Tom protested. She could read his face before he spoke. After 50 years together, she left behind more than an empty chair. She took with her the only person who understood that his silence wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. Long before cancer entered their lives, another burden had already followed Tom home from Iraq. He had retired as a command sergeant major after nearly 30 years in the United States Army. His career stretched from the final years of the Cold War through multiple deployments. After September 11, decorations lined a wooden display case in his hallway, though visitors rarely noticed because the glass had collected enough dust to blur the metals. Tom never talked about combat, not because he wanted people to wonder, because there were no words that felt honest enough. Some nights he still woke before dawn, convinced he had heard incoming mortar fire. Other mornings he stood at the kitchen sink holding an empty coffee mug, unable to remember why he'd walked into the room. His doctor called it chronic PTSD, complicated by prolonged grief. Tom called it Tuesday. His daughter Emily lived nearly 900 miles away in Boise with her husband and 2 children. She phoned every Sunday afternoon. At least she tried. The conversations rarely lasted more than 3 minutes. "How are you doing, Dad?" "I'm fine." "You eating okay?" "Yep." "I love you." "Love you too." Then silence. Eventually Emily would say goodbye, set her phone down, and wonder how someone who had once taught her to fish, taught her to drive, and danced with her at her wedding could disappear while still being alive. Tom wondered the same thing. Spring arrived slowly that year. Snow melted into muddy shoulders along Carbon County roads. Meadowlarks returned to fence posts. Ranchers began repairing barbed wire before summer grazing. Life moved forward because that's what life always did. Tom didn't. Each morning followed the same pattern. Wake at 4:47. Coffee. Feed the chickadees. Read exactly 12 pages of an old Louis L'Amour paperback. Sit on the porch. Watch nothing in particular. Repeat. Routine demanded nothing emotionally. That suited him. Until one Thursday afternoon when a flat tire outside the county animal shelter interrupted the only route he'd driven for years. The shelter wasn't much to look at. A converted maintenance building just outside town with faded blue siding. 2 chain-link exercise yards, and a hand-painted sign that leaned slightly after surviving too many. Montana winters. Tom only intended to borrow the air compressor. Instead, while waiting for a volunteer to unlock the storage shed, he heard something unusual. Not barking. Silence. Nearly every kennel echoed with nervous energy except one. At the far end sat an older chocolate. Labrador mixed with silver beginning to creep around his muzzle. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't whining. He simply watched people pass by. With calm amber eyes that seemed to have learned disappointment without surrendering to it. The dog's kennel card read, name, Rusty. Estimated age, 8. Owner surrender. No additional notes fit on the card. One of the volunteers noticed Tom looking. Funny thing, she said quietly. Everybody walks past him. Tom gave a small shrug. He doesn't do tricks. Doesn't jump around trying to impress anyone. Families usually pick younger dogs. Tom nodded once. The volunteer smiled sadly. I think he's just waiting for someone who isn't looking for excitement anymore. Tom looked at Rusty again. The dog never barked, never begged. He simply stood, gave one slow wag of his tail, and sat back down. For reasons Tom couldn't explain, that single wag lingered in his thoughts all the way home. That evening, for the first time in months, he left his untouched dinner on the kitchen table and found himself staring out the window instead of at the television remote. He wasn't thinking about adopting a dog. At least that's what he kept telling himself. But sometime after midnight, lying awake in the quiet house where every creak reminded him of someone he'd lost, another question settled into the darkness beside him. What if that dog wasn't the one waiting to be rescued? What if it was him? Tom told himself the visit to the shelter had been nothing more than an interruption to an ordinary Thursday. By Friday morning, he had almost convinced himself. He followed his routine exactly as he always did. Coffee brewed before sunrise. The bird feeder was filled while a cool breeze drifted across the cottonwoods, bordering his property. He drove into town for a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, and another paperback from the used shelf inside the library. Still, every quiet moment carried the same image. A chocolate Labrador sitting patiently behind a chain-link gate, not barking, just waiting. It irritated him more than he wanted to admit. For years he had worked hard to avoid attachments. Attachments became responsibilities. Responsibilities became things that could be taken away. He had buried enough friends in uniform. He had buried his wife. Even the old golden retriever Margaret had insisted on adopting years earlier had lived, just long enough for Tom to love him before arthritis and age made. Another painful goodbye unavoidable. He had promised himself there would be no more dogs, no more empty bowls after the house became quiet again, no more collars hanging unused beside the back door. By late Saturday afternoon, he found himself driving past the shelter anyway. He didn't turn into the parking lot. He kept going. Then, almost a mile down the road, he sighed, slowed the truck, and made a U-turn. You've lost your damn mind, he muttered to himself. The words surprised him. He hadn't spoken out loud in nearly 2 days. The volunteer from earlier recognized him immediately. I had a feeling we'd see you again. Tom gave the smallest shrug. I was nearby. She smiled politely without challenging the obvious excuse. My name's Claire. Tom, she extended a hand. His grip was firm but brief. Claire had worked at the shelter for nearly 12 years. In her early 60s herself, she had developed an uncanny ability to recognize loneliness. When it walked through the front door, it rarely arrived wearing sadness. More often, it looked exactly like Tom. She led him toward Rusty's kennel. He's been here almost 7 months. Tom frowned slightly. That long? Claire nodded. His owner was an 82-year-old Korean War veteran named Harold Jensen. Harold passed away unexpectedly after a stroke. The family lived out of state and couldn't take Rusty. Tom looked at the dog, so he lost his person. Claire didn't answer immediately. Finally, she said softly, I think they both did. Rusty stood as Tom approached. Still no barking, no frantic scratching. Instead, he walked over slowly until only the fence separated them. Tom crouched without thinking. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Rusty leaned forward just enough for his nose to touch Tom's weathered hand through the chain links. Not licking, not pawing, simply resting there, warm, steady. Trust offered carefully. Something tightened in Tom's chest. It reminded him of the first handshake he'd received from a frightened young private during deployment years ago. Someone trying to convince himself everything would be okay. Claire quietly unlocked the kennel. "You can spend a little time with him if you'd like." Tom hesitated, then stepped inside. Rusty sniffed his boots first, then circled once. Finally, he settled beside the old folding chair instead of climbing on too. Tom were demanding attention? The silence between them felt strangely comfortable, almost familiar. Tom reached down cautiously. His hand rested on Rusty's shoulder. The dog's fur was softer than he'd expected. Rusty closed his eyes. Tom realized he had been holding his breath. An hour disappeared without either of them doing much at all. Claire watched through the office window while pretending to organize paperwork. Most visitors spent their time trying to entertain dogs. Tom and Rusty simply existed together. Sometimes healing began that quietly. When Tom finally stood to leave, Rusty remained seated. No whining. No desperate scratching at the gate. Only those same amber eyes following him toward the exit. Claire walked him outside. "You don't have to decide today." "I know. He'd probably do well with someone who appreciates peace," Tom nodded. "I'll think about it." On the drive home, he realized he hadn't thought about Iraq once during that entire hour. Not the convoy, not the explosion, not the names he still carried silently every day. Just an old dog breathing beside him. It was the longest stretch of peace he'd experienced in years. That realization frightened him, because peace felt unfamiliar, and unfamiliar things could disappear. Emily called Sunday afternoon. As always, Tom answered after the third ring. "Hi, Dad." "Hi." She hesitated, expecting the usual short replies. "What did you do this weekend?" Normally he would have answered, "Nothing." Instead, there was a pause. "I stopped by the animal shelter." Emily blinked. "You did?" "Mm-hmm." There was another silence. Then she heard something she hadn't heard in months. Her father continued talking without being asked another question. "They've got an old lab there." "A Labrador?" "Mixed, I think." "What was he like?" Tom looked out the kitchen window. "Quiet." Emily smiled before she even realized it. "You sound like you liked him." "I didn't say that." "No." She laughed softly. "You didn't." Another pause settled over the phone. This one felt different. Not empty. Comfortable. When they hung up 10 minutes later, Emily stared at the call timer in disbelief. 10 minutes. It was the longest conversation she'd had with her father since her mother's funeral. She immediately called her husband. "I don't know what's happening," she whispered, almost afraid saying it aloud would ruin it. "But I think Dad is finally letting something back into his life." The following Wednesday, Tom returned to the shelter, carrying a faded canvas leash that had been hanging unused in his garage for 3 years. Claire noticed it before he spoke. "You made a decision?" Tom looked toward Rusty's kennel. "I figured." He stopped, searching for words that had become unfamiliar. Finally, he managed, "Maybe we could try helping each other." Claire's smile was gentle. "I think that's exactly what he's been waiting for." The paperwork took less than 20 minutes. Rusty climbed into the passenger seat of Tom's old Ford without hesitation, curled into a circle on the worn blanket spread across the seat, and rested his head against the door. Neither of them made a sound during the drive home, but when Tom pulled into his gravel driveway and shut off the engine, neither one moved to get out. Man and dog sat together in complete silence, looking at the familiar house. One wondering if he still knew how to share his life, the other wondering if this house would finally become home again. Then just as Tom reached for the door handle, Rusty let out a soft, uneasy whine and froze. His ears lifted toward the backyard. Something beyond the old fence had captured his full attention. For the first time since meeting him, the calm old Labrador looked genuinely uncertain. And Tom couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Rusty sensed wasn't outside the fence at all. It was something buried deep inside the life Tom had spent years refusing to face. Rusty didn't move. His body remained still in the passenger seat, but every muscle had tightened. His ears pointed toward the backyard, and his eyes stayed fixed beyond the weathered cedar fence as though he were trying to understand a place he'd never seen before. Tom waited. After nearly 30 years in the army, he'd learned there was a difference between panic and caution. Rusty wasn't afraid. He was simply taking in unfamiliar ground. "Well," Tom said quietly, surprising himself with the sound of his own voice. I suppose it's your yard now, too. Rusty looked at him. Then, almost as if those words had been enough, he stepped out of the truck. He didn't run. He didn't explore wildly. He walked beside Tom at an easy pace all the way to the front porch. The old Labrador paused at the threshold. Margaret had always believed dogs understood the meaning of a doorway. She used to say they knew the difference between visiting and belonging. Tom remembered laughing at that. Now, standing with one hand on the doorknob, he wasn't laughing. The house had belonged to only one person for 3 years. Opening that door to another living soul felt strangely monumental. Rusty glanced up at him. Go ahead. The dog crossed first. Nothing dramatic happened. Rusty didn't race from room to room. He didn't bark or sniff every corner. Instead, he wandered slowly through the living room, the hallway, the kitchen, pausing occasionally as though memorizing the scent of each space. He stopped longest in front of Margaret's old rocking chair. Tom watched from across the room. Rusty lowered himself onto the rug beside it. Not on it, beside it. He sighed once, closed his eyes. Tom felt an ache rise unexpectedly inside his chest. Margaret had spent countless evenings in that chair knitting blankets for church fundraisers, while their old golden retriever slept at her feet. Without realizing it, Tom whispered, "She would have liked you." The sentence hung in the air. He hadn't spoken Margaret's name aloud inside the house for months. Rusty opened one eye briefly before settling again. No miracle. No magical understanding, just quiet companionship. Somehow that made the moment even more meaningful. The first week passed awkwardly. Tom had forgotten how much another living creature altered the rhythm of a house. There were walks before breakfast, water bowls to refill, vet records to organize, dog food to buy. Rusty learned quickly. He never begged from the table, never chewed furniture, never barked at passing trucks. His habits reflected years spent with someone who valued routine. Tom found comfort in that. Every morning, Rusty waited patiently by the back door at exactly 6:30. Every evening, he settled near the fireplace around 8. Every night, he checked each room before lying down beside Tom's recliner. Not touching, just nearby. Close enough. One rainy Tuesday, Tom caught himself talking while repairing a loose cabinet hinge. "Hand me that screwdriver." He stopped. Rusty looked up. Tom chuckled softly. "I know." The dog wagged his tail once. "Guess you're not much help with tools." It wasn't a conversation. Not really. But it was more talking than the empty house had heard in years. People noticed. At Jensen's Hardware, Carl Jensen watched. Tom waiting patiently outside while Rusty sat beside him without a leash pulling or barking. Carl stepped outside carrying a box of deck screws. "Didn't know you got yourself a dog." Tom scratched behind Rusty's ears. "Seems he got me." Carl smiled. "Good-looking fellow." Tom nodded. "He is." The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Yet after Tom drove away, Carl turned to another customer and quietly said, "That's the most words I've heard out of Tom Callahan in, I don't know, maybe 5 years." A few days later, Tom took Rusty to the VA, outpatient clinic in Billings, for one of his routine appointments. Normally, he hated those visits. The waiting room always seemed full of men carrying invisible weight. Some joked loudly. Others stared at televisions without seeing them. Tom usually kept his head down until his name was called. This time, Rusty waited calmly at his feet. Across the room, another veteran in a Marine Corps cap smiled. "Beautiful dog." Tom looked up. "Thank you." "What breed?" "Lab mix." "Rescue?" "Yeah." The man nodded knowingly. "Mine rescued me too." Tom almost smiled. Almost. It was enough. During his appointment, Dr. Lisa Hernandez noticed the change before Tom even sat down. "You seem different." Tom shrugged. "I got a dog." "I heard." Claire from the shelter had apparently mentioned the adoption in a community newsletter that many local organizations shared. Dr. Hernandez leaned back. "How's that going?" Tom searched for an honest answer. "I leave the house more." "Anything else?" "I've started talking." She smiled gently. "So I've noticed." He looked away. "It's mostly to him." "It still counts." For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, she asked, "How are the nightmares?" Tom thought carefully. "They're still there." "And afterward?" He considered that too. "When I wake up," he hesitated. "I'm not waking up alone anymore." Dr. Hernandez didn't rush to fill the silence. She simply nodded. Years of treating combat veterans had taught her that healing rarely announced itself dramatically. Sometimes it arrived disguised as a sentence that would have been impossible 6 months earlier. Not every day was easier. Some evenings memories returned with crushing force. One night a thunderstorm rolled across the valley. A crack of lightning shook the windows. Before Tom was fully awake, he was standing in the hallway, heart pounding, searching for body armor that wasn't there. His breathing grew shallow. The walls seemed to close in. Rusty didn't bark. He didn't jump. He walked over slowly and leaned his shoulder against Tom's leg. Nothing more, just steady pressure. A quiet reminder that the storm outside was only rain. Minutes passed before Tom's heartbeat slowed. He sank into the hallway against the wall. Rusty lay beside him. Neither moved until dawn began coloring the eastern sky. Later that morning, Tom found himself standing in front of the dusty wooden display case holding his military medals. He hadn't opened it since Margaret's funeral. One by one, he wiped dust from the glass. The bronze stars, the ribbons, the unit patches. Finally, his eyes settled on a folded American flag resting in the corner. Beside it sat a photograph from Iraq. 6 soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, smiling into a desert wind. Only 3 had made it home. Tom stared at the picture for a very long time. Rusty quietly lay behind him, not asking anything, not expecting anything, simply staying. For years, Tom had avoided looking directly at that photograph. Now, for the first time, he picked it up. On the back, Margaret had written in careful handwriting, "The people we lose deserve to be remembered, not hidden away." Tom read the sentence twice, then 3 times. His hands trembled. He realized he had spent years trying to bury grief so deeply that he'd nearly buried the people themselves. That afternoon, he made a decision he hadn't considered in over a decade. He reached into a kitchen drawer, found an old address book, and slowly flipped to a name he hadn't called since retiring from the Army. Colonel Daniel Brooks, his former commanding officer, his closest friend during his final deployment. The phone number might not even work anymore. Tom stared at it for several minutes before setting the book on the table. Rusty watched quietly from across the room. Calling Daniel would mean reopening a part of his life he'd kept locked away for years. But something had begun changing inside him, not because a dog had magically healed his wounds. Because day after day, Rusty's quiet presence had reminded him of something Tom had forgotten long ago. Healing didn't begin the moment pain disappeared. It began the moment someone or something made the silence feel safe enough to break. Tom reached for the phone. His finger hovered over the first number. Then it stopped. He wasn't afraid Daniel wouldn't answer. He was afraid he would. Tom kept staring at the phone. The number had faded slightly in the old address book, the ink softened by time and countless moves. Margaret had written it neatly years ago, insisting that paper never lost battery power. His finger rested on the first digit. Then he pulled his hand away. "Not today," he whispered. Rusty stretched out near the kitchen window, lifted his head, but didn't move. Tom closed the address book. Some doors, he told himself, needed another day. Maybe another year. Life settled into a rhythm that no longer felt empty. Every morning, Tom and Rusty walked the same 2-mile loop along the Stillwater River just after sunrise. The trail wasn't remarkable. Packed dirt, cottonwood trees, weathered wooden benches donated by local families, but it had become familiar. People began expecting to see them. Old Earl Mackenzie, who fished nearly every morning, tipped his cap. "Morning, Tom." "Morning." A month earlier, Tom might have answered with only a nod. Now there was a word, sometimes 2. Children riding bicycles learned Rusty's name before they learned Tom's. "Can we pet him?" Tom always looked to Rusty first. The old Labrador would quietly wag his tail and sit. "He says yes." The children laughed every time. One little boy with freckles wrapped both arms around Rusty's neck before looking up at Tom. "Mister, your dog's really nice." Tom smiled. "He teaches me that every day." As the boy rode away, Tom realized what he had just done. He had smiled at a stranger, not out of politeness, because he genuinely meant it. Claire noticed the change, too. She had invited Tom to stop by the shelter one Saturday morning, claiming they had a leaky shelf she couldn't repair. Tom knew exactly what she was doing. He came anyway. Within 20 minutes, the shelf was level again. Within 40 minutes, he had repaired a broken kennel latch, adjusted 2 sagging gates, and replaced a cracked section of fencing. "You don't have to work this hard," Claire said. Tom tightened one final bolt. "I know." "Then why are you?" He wiped his hands on an old shop towel. "Feels good fixing something." Claire smiled knowingly. "Things." Tom looked across the yard, where Rusty was calmly watching another rescue dog chase a tennis ball. "No," he paused. "Myself." Claire didn't answer. Sometimes the most important conversations ended exactly where they should. By midsummer, Tom had become an unofficial volunteer. Tuesday mornings, he repaired whatever needed repairing. Thursday afternoons, he walked older dogs that visitors often overlooked. He found himself drawn to the quiet ones, the anxious shepherd who flinched at loud noises, the arthritic beagle no family seemed interested in, the elderly border collie whose owner had entered a nursing home. Claire watched him patiently introducing each dog to Rusty, who never acted possessive or territorial. Instead, Rusty greeted every newcomer with the same calm dignity that had first captured Tom's attention. "You know," Claire said one afternoon, "people trust dogs." Tom nodded. "They're smarter than us." "I wasn't talking about the dogs." He looked confused. She continued, "They see you with Rusty. So, they see a veteran who doesn't rush scared animals." She smiled gently. "They assume you'll treat people the same way." Tom hadn't thought about it that way. Maybe she was right. Without realizing it, he'd started making eye contact again, listening longer, speaking a little more. Healing had begun changing not just how he felt, but how other people experienced him. Late in August, an envelope arrived from Boise. Inside were 2 crayon drawings. One showed a large brown dog standing beside a man wearing a baseball cap. The other simply read, "Grandpa and Rusty." Tom sat at the kitchen table for several minutes, studying the pictures. A note from Emily accompanied them. "Dad, Ethan drew these after our last video call. He keeps asking when he can meet Rusty in person. We were thinking about driving to Montana over Labor Day if that's okay with you. No pressure. We just miss you." Tom folded the letter carefully. For 3 years, he had politely declined every invitation. Birthdays, Thanksgiving, Christmas, graduations, always another excuse. Too tired. Too far. Maybe next year. The truth was simpler. He didn't know how to be around people anymore, especially the people he loved most. Rusty walked over and rested his chin lightly on Tom's knee. Tom scratched behind his ears absent-mindedly. "What do you think?" Rusty blinked. Tom smiled. "Not much help there either." Still, the question stayed with him all afternoon. That evening, he called Emily. She answered before the first ring had finished. "Dad, I got the drawings. Weren't they cute?" "They're on the refrigerator." Emily laughed. "You actually put something on the refrigerator?" "I figured they deserved better than a drawer." There was silence. Happy silence. Then Tom cleared his throat. "You still planning on Labor Day?" Emily held her breath. If you'd like us to." "I think," he stopped. The words felt enormous. "I think I'd like that." Emily closed her eyes. Tears filled them before she could stop them. "We'd love that." After hanging up, she turned to her husband. "He invited us." He stared. "Are you serious?" She nodded, crying and laughing at the same time. "He invited us." But healing rarely followed a straight road. 3 days before Emily's visit, Tom received another phone call. This one came from the VA. "Dr. Hernandez." "Tom," she said gently, "I wanted to let you know we've scheduled the annual memorial breakfast next Friday." He immediately stiffened. Every September, the local VA hosted a gathering honoring veterans from the region who had passed away during military service. Tom had attended exactly once, years ago. He never returned. Too many names, too many faces, too many memories that refused to stay in the past. "I don't think so. I understand." She waited, then added carefully, "Colonel Daniel Brooks is expected to attend." Tom froze. "Daniel? He volunteers every year now." Tom hadn't spoken Daniel's name aloud since opening the address book. Apparently, life had decided not to wait for him to make that phone call. After ending the conversation, Tom walked outside. The evening sky glowed orange beyond the mountains. Rusty followed quietly. Tom sat on the porch steps. "I don't know if I can do it." Rusty settled beside him. For several minutes, neither moved. Then Tom looked toward the old pickup parked in the driveway. He imagined driving to the VA, walking into that room, seeing Daniel after more than a decade, remembering everything, or worse, discovering how much they had both forgotten. Labor Day was only days away. His daughter and grandchildren were finally coming home. And now the past, the part of himself he had spent years outrunning, was beginning to catch up. This time, there would be no turning around before the parking lot. The road ahead led only one direction, straight through the memories he had spent half a lifetime trying not to feel. Labor Day weekend arrived beneath a sky so clear it seemed almost unfair. The Beartooth Mountains stood sharp against the horizon, their early hints of autumn brushing the highest peaks with gold. Traffic through Red Lodge was heavier than usual. Motorcyclists stopped for coffee before heading toward the scenic highway. Families wandered the sidewalks with ice cream cones, and American flags fluttered from storefronts in the late summer breeze. Tom noticed almost none of it. He had swept the front porch twice. He had changed the bed sheets in the guest room. He had even gone to the grocery store with an actual list, instead of buying the same 6 items he always bought. Rusty followed him from room to room, watching with quiet curiosity. "You'd think the president was coming," Tom muttered while adjusting a picture frame Margaret had hung years earlier. Rusty thumped his tail against the hardwood floor. Tom smiled. "No offense." At 11:30, a silver SUV turned into the gravel driveway. Tom stood on the porch without realizing he'd stopped breathing. The driver's door opened first. Emily stepped out. For just a second, she looked exactly like Margaret had at 35. Same determined eyes, same gentle smile that always seemed to appear a heartbeat before she spoke. Then 2 children burst from the back seat. 8-year-old Ethan sprinted toward the porch. 6-year-old Lily followed, struggling to keep up. "Grandpa!" Tom barely had time to kneel before Ethan wrapped both arms around him. The hug was sudden, fierce, and completely unguarded. Tom froze. Then, slowly, his arms came around his grandson. He closed his eyes. There had been a time when physical affection came naturally. Then came war. Then came loss. Then came years of forgetting how to receive love, without wondering when it would disappear. Ethan pulled back first. "Where's Rusty?" Almost on cue, the old Labrador padded through the front door. Lily gasped. "He's bigger than I thought." Rusty sat politely. The children looked at Tom. "Can we?" Tom nodded. "You can." Rusty accepted, their excitement with the same patient dignity he offered everyone else. No jumping. No barking. Just a gentle tail wag as 2 small hands scratched behind his ears. Emily watched from a few feet away. She wasn't looking at the dog. She was looking at her father. He was smiling, not politely. Not because someone expected him to. He was genuinely smiling at his grandchildren. She hadn't seen that expression in years. Quietly, she walked onto the porch. "Hi, Dad." Tom stood. For a moment, neither knew exactly what to do. Then Emily stepped forward and hugged him. This time, he didn't hesitate. He hugged her back immediately. "I'm glad you're here," he said. Emily swallowed hard. "So are we." The weekend unfolded gently. No grand speeches. No dramatic reconciliations. Just ordinary moments that somehow felt extraordinary. Tom taught Ethan how to skip flat stones across the Stillwater River. Lily insisted on brushing Rusty's coat every afternoon. Emily cooked in the kitchen where Margaret had spent decades making Sunday dinners. For the first time in years, laughter echoed through every room of the house. On Sunday evening, they gathered around the backyard fire pit. The children roasted marshmallows. Rusty stretched out nearby, occasionally opening one eye whenever someone laughed particularly loudly. Ethan pointed toward the stars. "Grandpa, were you scared in the army?" The question settled over the fire. Emily instinctively looked down. She was ready to redirect the conversation. Tom had avoided questions like that for years. He stared into the flames, then answered honestly. "Yes." Ethan looked surprised. "Really?" Tom nodded. "Anybody who tells you they were never scared either wasn't paying attention or isn't telling the truth." "What did you do?" "I kept going." "Even when you were scared?" Tom smiled faintly. "Especially then." The boy thought about that. "So courage isn't not being scared?" Tom looked at his grandson with quiet pride. "No." He poked gently at the fire with a stick. "Courage is doing the right thing even while you're scared." Emily watched silently. Her father had just shared more about himself in 2 minutes than he had during the previous 5 years combined, not because anyone forced him, because he wanted his grandson to understand. Monday morning arrived too quickly. Suitcases returned to the SUV. Goodbyes approached. Lily hugged Rusty first. "I'm going to miss you." Rusty licked her hand once. Ethan hugged his grandfather. "Can we come back?" Tom answered without hesitation. "I hope you do." Emily lingered after the children climbed into the vehicle. She looked toward Rusty. "I owe him." Tom shook his head. "No," she frowned. "He didn't fix me." Emily waited. "He reminded me," Tom said quietly, "that I still wanted fixing." Neither spoke for several seconds. Finally, Emily kissed his cheek. "I've missed you," Tom's voice caught. "I know." As the SUV disappeared down the gravel road, Tom stood beside Rusty until it vanished from sight. The old emptiness tried to return. He felt it. The familiar whisper that the house would become silent again. But this time the silence wasn't empty. Drawings still hung on the refrigerator. A forgotten toy truck sat beneath the couch. Tiny fingerprints marked the back window where Lily had waved goodbye. Life had entered the house and left pieces of itself behind. Friday morning came. The VA memorial breakfast. Tom stood in front of the bathroom mirror, adjusting the collar of a clean, blue button-down shirt. Rusty watched from the hallway. "You don't have to come." Rusty stood anyway. Tom chuckled. "Yeah, I figured." The drive to Billings felt longer than usual. Every mile carried another memory. Another reason to turn around. Twice he nearly did. Twice he kept driving. The parking lot outside the Veterans Center was already filling when he arrived. Men and women in faded unit caps greeted one another. Some embraced. Some stood quietly before the memorial wall. Tom remained inside the truck for nearly 5 minutes. His hands rested motionless on the steering wheel. "I can't." Rusty looked at him, not pleading, simply waiting. Tom took one slow breath, then another. Finally, he opened the door. Inside the hall, volunteers poured coffee while families arranged photographs of loved ones on long display tables. A bugler quietly rehearsed taps in another room. The familiar notes reached Tom like echoes from another lifetime. His chest tightened. For an instant, he wasn't in Montana. He was back in Iraq. Dust, heat, helicopter blades, radio chatter, someone yelling for a medic. He stopped walking. His breathing became shallow. Rusty stepped closer until their shoulders touched. Steady, grounded, present. Tom focused on the weight beside his leg, the polished floor beneath his boots, the smell of fresh coffee. Gradually, the flashback loosened its grip. A voice came from across the room. "Tom," he looked up. A tall man with silver hair and an unmistakably military posture stood frozen beside one of the display tables. Time had added wrinkles. It hadn't changed the eyes. "Colonel Daniel Brooks." For several seconds, neither man moved. Then Daniel crossed the room. When they finally stood face to face, neither reached for a handshake. Neither saluted. Daniel simply pulled Tom into a hug. A real one. The kind shared only by people who had survived something together that few others could understand. When they stepped apart, Daniel smiled sadly. "I've been trying to find you for years." Tom looked down. "I know. You knew?" "I never answered." Daniel nodded once. "I figured." Neither man blamed the other. There was too much history for blame. Daniel glanced at Rusty. "So," a faint smile appeared, "this must be the soldier everybody's been talking about." Tom looked at Rusty, then back at his old friend. "No." His voice was steady. "This one's the reason I finally came home." At that exact moment, the ceremony coordinator stepped onto the small stage and asked everyone to take their seats. Tom followed Daniel toward the front row. He didn't yet know that before the morning was over, he would hear a story that would force him to confront the one memory he had carried as a burden for nearly 20 years, the memory that had convinced him, deep down, that he didn't deserve the peaceful life. Rusty had quietly helped him begin to rebuild. The room grew quiet as everyone found their seats. Tom sat beside Daniel near the front, Rusty lying calmly at his feet. Across the stage stood photographs of men and women from Carbon County and the surrounding communities who had never come home, along with veterans who had returned but had since passed on. Candles flickered beneath the framed pictures, and the low murmur of conversation faded into respectful silence. The ceremony was simple. A local high school choir sang the national anthem. A retired Navy chaplain offered a brief prayer. Names were read slowly, one after another, each followed by the soft ring of a bell. Tom listened without looking up. He knew too many of the names. Each one carried a face, a laugh, a last conversation, a promise to grab coffee when they got home. Promises that had never been kept. When the ceremony ended, people lingered over coffee and breakfast. Small groups formed naturally around old friends who hadn't seen one another in years. Daniel placed a hand on Tom's shoulder. "Walk with me?" Tom nodded. They stepped outside to a small memorial garden behind the building where a row of cottonwoods cast long morning shadows across neatly trimmed grass. For several minutes, neither man spoke. They had spent years leading soldiers together. Both understood that silence often came before truth. Finally, Daniel broke it. "You've been carrying something." Tom gave a tired smile. "I've been carrying a lot of things. I don't mean the war." Tom stopped walking. Daniel looked at him with the same steady expression he had worn decades earlier when young soldiers came into his office believing they had failed. "You've blamed yourself ever since Sergeant Mike Donnelly was killed." Tom's eyes immediately dropped. The name landed like a weight. Mike Donnelly, 34 years old, father of two, the best mechanic in the battalion, the man who could make an entire convoy laugh during 12-hour drives through endless desert. Tom hadn't spoken his name aloud in nearly 20 years. "I should have changed the route," Tom whispered. Daniel didn't answer immediately. "You still believe that?" "I signed the orders." "You signed the safest route based on every piece of intelligence we had." "It wasn't safe." "No," Daniel said quietly. "It wasn't." The breeze moved gently through the trees. Tom stared toward the mountains. "I hear his wife sometimes." Daniel frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've imagined explaining it to her 1,000 times. His voice shook. "I kept thinking, if I'd done one thing differently." Daniel let him finish. "He would have come home." Daniel looked directly at him. "I visited Mike's family 6 months after we returned." Tom blinked. "You never told me. You never let anyone close enough to tell you." Tom remained silent. Daniel continued. "She asked if Mike had been afraid." Tom swallowed. "He was." Daniel nodded. "I told her the truth." He paused. "I told her Mike trusted his command sergeant major with his life." Tom closed his eyes. Daniel's voice remained calm. "And do you know what she said?" Tom slowly shook his head. "She said, then he died believing the man leading him cared enough to bring everyone home." The words settled between them. Tom felt something inside him begin to crack, not violently, quietly, like ice melting after a long winter. Daniel stepped closer. "You've spent 20 years punishing yourself for surviving." Tom couldn't answer. "Mike's family never blamed you." A tear rolled down Tom's face. "They lost a husband and a father." "Yes. And they refused to lose you too." Tom covered his eyes with one hand. For years he had replayed that convoy in perfect detail. Every radio transmission, every decision, every explosion. He had never once imagined the conversation Daniel was describing. He had sentenced himself without ever hearing the verdict from the people whose forgiveness mattered most. Rusty stood and gently rested against Tom's leg. The familiar, steady pressure grounded him once again. Daniel smiled. "Good dog." Tom nodded. "The best." A week later, Daniel called with an unexpected invitation. "Our veterans mentoring group needs another volunteer." Tom laughed softly. "I haven't exactly been the poster child for healthy coping. Maybe that's exactly why we need you." Tom thought about it for a long time. He remembered how frightened he had been walking into the shelter. How impossible every small step had seemed. If someone had told him then that he would one day help other veterans find their footing again, he would have dismissed it outright. Now it didn't seem impossible, only difficult, and difficult no longer scared him the way it once had. He accepted. Autumn settled gently over Red Lodge. Every Wednesday afternoon, Tom met with veterans newly adjusting to civilian life or struggling years after retirement. He didn't give speeches. He didn't pretend to have perfect answers. Mostly he listened. Sometimes that was enough. Occasionally someone noticed Rusty lying nearby and smiled. "He always this calm?" Tom would grin. "Usually calmer than the rest of us." Several veterans eventually adopted rescue dogs of their own. Not because Tom recommended it to everyone. He didn't. He simply encouraged people to find something, or Someone that made tomorrow worth showing up for. For some, it was woodworking. For others, fishing. For a few, it was another forgotten dog waiting quietly in a shelter. Healing, Tom had learned, never followed the same trail twice. Winter arrived with deep Montana snow. Emily and the children visited again for Christmas. The house no longer echoed. Cookies baked in Margaret's old kitchen. Christmas lights lined the porch. Lily insisted Rusty needed his own stocking. Ethan spent an afternoon helping Grandpa build a bird feeder in the garage. While they worked, Ethan looked up. "Grandpa? Yeah, I'm glad you got Rusty." Tom looked toward the old Labrador sleeping in a patch of afternoon sunlight. "So am I." But Ethan tilted his head. "I think Rusty's glad he got you." Tom smiled. "I think you might be right." Years later, after Rusty's muzzle had turned almost completely silver and his walks had become slower, people around Red Lodge would often see an older veteran sitting on the same porch where silence had once ruled the house. Neighbors stopped to talk. Children waved from bicycles. Veterans dropped by for coffee. Family visited often. The loneliness that had once defined the place had quietly been replaced by ordinary life. Not perfect, not free from grief. Margaret was still missed every day. The memories of war never completely disappeared. Some nights were still difficult. Some anniversaries still hurt, but pain no longer had the final word. One spring morning, Tom stood in the backyard watching. Rusty sniffed the fresh grass beneath the cottonwoods. The old dog moved more slowly now, pausing often to enjoy the warm sunshine. Tom realized something that would have sounded impossible just a few years earlier. The greatest gift Rusty had given him wasn't happiness, it was permission. Permission to grieve without hiding. Permission to remember without drowning. Permission to answer the phone, to hug his daughter, to tell his grandson the truth, to ask for help. To believe that surviving did not require living the rest of his life in silence. People in town often said the rescue dog had saved the old veteran. Tom would always smile when he heard it. Then he'd gently shake his head. "The shelter rescued a lonely dog," he would say. "But what changed my life wasn't that he found me." He'd look down at Rusty, whose tail would still give that same slow, patient wag. It was that every single day after that, he quietly reminded me to find myself. And in the end, that became the story everyone remembered, not of a war hero who conquered his past, or a remarkable dog who performed miracles, but of two weary souls who arrived at the same doorstep carrying different kinds of loss, and discovered that healing rarely begins with grand gestures. More often, it begins with a shared silence that no longer feels empty, a hand resting on familiar fur, a door opened when it would have been easier to keep it closed, and the quiet, stubborn decision to believe that even after the hardest chapters of a life, there is still another page worth turning.